it's funny because if you look at old quotes, there are people that like were Bitcoiners before the Bitcoin existed. Like if you look at Hayek, for example,
Yep.
he's like the only way
Yeah.
that you're gonna have good money again is if someone can introduce a sly, roundabout way to separate money from state. He's basically describing Bitcoin before it existed. Again, Henry Ford talked about a currency of energy and that
Yep.
gold was too centralized.
Sovereign individual.
A lot of people discuss this thing, and so it's kind of remarkable that it happened. And I think we can envision now two very different futures. So we know that money is going to be increasingly digital, more so than it already is. Right now, we think of it as digital. People joke and they're like, "Well, the dollar's already digital." It's like, well, it also runs on those very old pipes, for lack of a better word. There's this old legacy infrastructure, and then we interact with it in a digital way, but it still goes through these centralized pipes. And stable coins are quite different ways to transmit value. And so obviously money's going more digital, and it just becomes, is it going to be more state and surveillance controlled, right? So almost like using Satoshi's invention against him, where this technology can enable CBDCs, it can enable essentially highly regulated private stable coins that might as well be CBDCs. For example, they can blacklist any addresses they want, they can block transactions. You have that approach, or you have Bitcoin, where it's kind of a defense against nations that are maybe being improper. And it's one of those things where if you're in a developed market, it can sound almost like you're an anarchist, for example. If you're like you want to separate money from state, but it's not easy. It's not hard to envision it if you live in Russia, or you live in China, or you live in Nigeria, for example. Right? There's been cases that have been, I think, at this point well documented by the media, where, for example, Putin's opposition that is heavily repressed begins using Bitcoin because they can keep their payment, they can get donations, they can send payments. You see it happening in Nigeria, where there's protest groups pop up. They're protesting police violence, and then their bank accounts get frozen, and they can resort to Bitcoin. And so, there's been analysis showing, I think from Freedom House, showing that over the past 10, 15 years, the world's becoming slightly more authoritarian around the margins. We had this period from, say, the 80s and 90s. We started entering this period of liberalization. We had a declining authoritarianism, but now it's on the rise again. And I think also that the pandemic showed that even in developed markets, we brought up all these new debates about human rights and restrictions on mobility and things like that. And so in that type of world where technology can increasingly be used to surveil and control populations, that there's this technology that can actually also enable them. And I think we can envision two different futures depending on which path ends up winning.
Well, centralized versus decentralized. We actually released a show today that I recorded with Mark Moss. The title will seem hyperbolic, but it was Bitcoin. What was it? The fate for the future of humanity, or the fight for the future of humanity. Where it's essentially a world that's becoming more centralized. The only way to fight back against that is decentralization, and therefore, what is the best tool we have? Well, it is Bitcoin. And it sounds hyperbolic, and I think for some people who aren't even in the world of Bitcoin, they think this is absurd, but it might be right.
I think what people miss is that history goes through these big cycles, these big pendulum swings.
Yep.
And people naturally have recency bias, where they look over the past 30, 40 years, and they can't envision the world being any different. Whereas that 30 and 40 year period looks crazy compared to people in the prior 30 or 40 year period.
Yep.
It happens with, for example, like laborers and capital. You see this political shift back and forth between who has more of the power. Sometimes you hit an extreme, you have a revolution, or you just kind of, have a kind of a partial revolution and have like a popular swing back. So there's that keeps changing. As we talked about, these monetary systems keep changing. So you go from gold standard to failed gold standard to Bretton Woods to petrodollar system. You go through these changes over time. And so right now we've been in this kind of period of increasing centralization, increasing digitization. And if you go back to, for example, sci-fi writers, they've been kind of forecasting this, talking about that the more technology exists, the more it enables governments to have kind of almost a perfect authoritarianism. Like imagine Soviet Russia if they had the surveillance that you have today, including financial surveillance and surveillance blocking, right? That's essentially what China's kind of moving towards in some ways. And so I think if people think internationally, some of those things seem less crazy. Even if their local country might be benign in the relative sense, I think it's one of those things where you can you can like government, but still view that at the end of the day, the government should be more afraid of the people than the people are afraid of the government, right? So it's always good to have that tool that kind of keeps powers in check to avoid that kind of, absolute power, the ability to stop transactions, block anything, surveil anything, and then there's no checks anymore.
So what about Ethereum, Lyn? Could that be world money? I saw you wrote another article. I read it. That was an epic article. I'll direct people to it, but you did a review of proof of work versus proof of stake. I don't think I can let you leave today without just touching on that very, very quickly. Firstly, were they mean to you again?
Not really. I mean, I think
They were last time.
they were there. Well, it depends. Every community has individuals. So some people engage constructively, other ones engage aggressively. And my overall approach, I try to characterize it as there's Bitcoin, and then there's everything else is essentially a security. It's either like literally security or it's essentially very equity-like, right? So I generally don't go so far as to say that every other application of blockchain is, worth absolutely nothing. It's not worth exploring. I'm not on that end of the extreme, but I don't view them as money for sure. I view them more like equity platforms, and many of them use scammy tactics. Some more than, again, there's a spectrum. So you have outright scams, and then you have well-meaning projects that are advancing things in ways that maybe Bitcoin has been slow to, right? So in a sense, they're kind of these little trial areas. But there's a difference between that and money, right? So you have kind of this startup equity-like thing versus sound money. And so essentially the downside of any blockchain other than Bitcoin is that they're not sufficiently decentralized. So Bitcoin starts with high decentralization and then makes really rough trade-offs to have that decentralization. Essentially, blockchains are really inefficient databases. And in order to have it be decentralized, at least with the technology that we currently that we know of, you have to have a very small and tight database so that it can be held very, very peer-to-peer and that it's resistant to any sort of centralized attack surfaces. You don't want to be like the White Walker army where if you take out the Night King, they all die, right? You don't want that. That's how most blockchains are constructed. They have a Night King, and if you take out the Night King, the war is over. Whereas you want to have it so that you're a zombie apocalypse where there's every unit is completely autonomous. There's no centralized attack surfaces, and so Bitcoin is it's maybe not perfect, but it's by far the closest thing we have to a truly decentralized system. Whereas all those other ones they make fewer of the trade-offs that Bitcoin did, and therefore they have these bigger attack surfaces. And so essentially some of them in the long arc of time when we get through periods of speculation and we see what technology sticks around, maybe blockchains are useful for certain applications. But the more they're useful for, in many cases, at least on the base layer, the more prone they are to centralization, being changeable, and therefore not really being that kind of money for enemies or global money or global collateral, whatever you want to call it.
Or ultrasound money.
Well, I think that whole thing popped up because, essentially if you define how sound your money is by what the inflation rate is currently, like you can imagine two systems. Imagine, for example, a country like Singapore says, we're going to maintain this money supply. And then they do it for a few years. And they say, we're ultrasound money now. But it's still the case that at any given time, if you have a change in leadership, for example, you could change your monetary policy. Whereas something like gold, for example, if you look over the past century, they've never really made more than like 2% of new gold per year, right? It pretty much no matter what gold price does, you have that hard constraint in terms of how much gold you can produce. Compared to that fiat currency system, that's a much more sound system. So it's not just whether or not you have inflation or deflation, it's whether you can even change it or whether a centralized entity can even change it. And so it's not just about being quote unquote deflationary or less inflationary. It's about how reliable, how much trust we place in the idea that 10 years later, that exact monetary policy is still going to be in place.
But back to proof of stake, the TLDR.
That I essentially viewed as equity-like, where it's inherently centralization. I've seen it described as kind of a proof of work in disguise in some ways. And it's one of those things where maybe it's useful for certain applications, but it's not when you choose if you want to maximize decentralization and have it be this kind of global money that's rather resistant to state attacks.
Yeah. Well, we did it. We've had a good year, Lyn. We've made 11 shows, I think. We missed one.
Yeah, I was traveling.
You were traveling.
Yeah.
So selfish. What are you looking forward to next year?
I'm looking forward to see. So right now we're obviously in an inflation period. I'm looking to see what happens with some of these transition periods, right? So we've had this period where the United States did a lot of fiscal stimulus, and we're facing kind of a fiscal cliff. We're going to see how they navigate that. They're also now trying to tighten monetary policy into this inflation. On the other hand, China went through this big crackdown year, and based on political realities, we're probably going to see them trying to have the dust settle and kind of move up a little bit. And so we're going to see how these cycle turns play out. And Bitcoin's big enough where it's a macro asset now. It's like if you use Google as an example, when Google was a young company, regardless of what the economy was doing, it could grow at like 100% a year because it's just eating market share from other advertising methods and other search engines and things like that. But once it becomes by far the dominant player in its industry, it now is the economy. So if the economy slows or accelerates, Google's affected. And Bitcoin's kind of like that, where when it's super small, it's its own thing. It always had kind of some linkage to liquidity in some ways, but when it becomes more institutionally held and more widely held, it becomes a little bit more tied to economic cycles. And you can see, it obviously liquidity affects it very much, but also things like inflation and other variables. So I'm curious to see if we start to get some decoupling, say with Bitcoin compared to growth stocks or compared to the stock market in general. I'd be curious to see some of those. We could see inflationary pressures damage company margins, for example, and you could see stocks run into some turbulence while maybe, the advantage of commodities in inflationary environments is they don't have margins. They are, they're the things that are in many cases eating into other companies' margins. And so you could see a decoupling. And so there's a bunch of things like that I'm looking for, and just looking for ongoing maturation of the industry. I'm looking to see some of the developments that might happen because of Taproot, right? So it's one of those things where maybe it was overemphasized initially, but then underemphasized when you look out several years, the things that could develop from it. I'm watching Lightning. I'm watching all sorts of things. There's all sorts of development that's happening that I'm excited about.
Well, it's going to be a big year. Thank you again for everything you've done this year. I think you're brilliant. I really do. I think everyone does. Whenever I post a show, it's constant, amazing comments. I still can't understand how you know so much stuff, but it's an absolute pleasure to talk to you every month, and I really appreciate you coming on the show. I wish you a happy Christmas and New Year, and let's see what we do next year.